Katie Sullivan sat in her chair on the bridge of the human ship UES Liberty and watched the stars through the big window in front of her. She was thinking about the trade deal they had just finished with the miners on Centauri Station when the communication system made a loud beeping sound that meant someone was sending them an urgent message. The young woman at the communication desk turned around with a worried look on her face and said the message was coming from the Galactic Council headquarters on Nexus Prime. Katie felt her stomach drop because the Council never sent urgent messages, unless something was very wrong. She told the communication officer to put the message on the main screen, and everyone on the bridge stopped what they were doing to listen. The voice that came through the speakers was cold and formal and belonged to someone from the Zenari Empire who spoke in the mechanical way that all Zenari used when they were being official. The message said that humanity was being called to appear before the full Galactic Council to answer serious charges that had been brought against them. The charges included breaking the sacred accords, of peaceful coexistence in multiple ways, and the development of technologies that were forbidden under galactic law. The message said that Ambassador Katie Sullivan and her diplomatic team were required to appear at Nexus Prime within 10 standard days, or humanity would be declared in violation of Council authority. Katie looked over at Colonel Jake Morrison, who was standing near the tactical station with his arms crossed and a deep frown on his scarred face. Jake had been a soldier for 20 years and had fought in 3 different wars before becoming a military advisor to the diplomatic corps. He knew trouble when he saw it, and his expression told Katie that this was more trouble than they had ever faced before. Dr. Lisa Chang was sitting at her workstation reviewing the formal charges that had been transmitted along with the summons. Lisa was the smartest person Katie had ever met, and she could read legal documents faster than most people could read simple stories. Her face was getting paler as she read through each charge, and Katie knew that meant the situation was even worse than it appeared. The first charge said that humanity had established colonies in sectors that were restricted under the sacred accords. The second charge said that humans had developed military weapons that exceeded the power limits set by the Council treaties. The third charge was the most serious and said that humanity had created artificial intelligence systems that went beyond what was allowed under galactic law. Katie knew that all 3 charges were technically true, but they did not tell the whole story. The colonies had been built in empty space that no other species wanted until humans made them valuable. The weapons had been developed after human merchant ships kept getting attacked by pirates and raiders while the Council did nothing to help. The artificial intelligence project had started when it became clear that humanity needed better ways to protect itself because no one else would. Dr. Chang finished reading the charges and looked up at Katie with concern in her eyes. She said that the evidence presented with the charges was very detailed and showed that someone had been watching human activities very carefully for a long time. The documents included sensor readings from human colonies, energy signatures from human weapons tests, and intercepted communications about something called Project Prometheus, which was supposed to be one of humanity's most secret programs. Colonel. Morrison walked over to Katie's chair and spoke in a quiet voice so the rest of the bridge crew could not hear what he was saying. He told her that this felt like a setup and that the Council had probably already decided what they wanted to do to humanity before they sent the summons. He said that in his experience, when people gathered this much evidence before a trial, it meant they were not planning to listen to any explanations or defenses. Katie ordered the ship to change course for Nexus Prime and told the crew to prepare for maximum speed. She knew they needed to get there as quickly as possible, and she also knew they needed to contact Earth to tell the government what was happening. The communication with Earth took several hours because of the distance and the need to use secure channels that could not be intercepted by other species. When President Alex Bennett appeared on the secure communication screen, he looked tired and worried. Katie explained the charges and showed him the evidence that had been presented. The president listened carefully and asked Dr. Chang to give her analysis of the legal situation. Lisa said that the charges were written in a way that made it almost impossible to defend against them, even though the human actions had been justified. Colonel. Morrison told the president that this looked like the other council species had decided that humanity was growing too powerful and they wanted to stop human expansion before it became a threat to their own interests. He said that the timing was suspicious because it came right after humanity had successfully defended several colonies against attacks by the Vorthak Collective. President Bennett was quiet for a long time after hearing all the information. Finally, he told Katie that she should go to Nexus Prime and present humanity's case as strongly as possible, but she should also be prepared for the possibility that the Council had already made their decision. He said that humanity would not accept any agreement that left them defenseless or confined them to just the Earth system. As the UES Liberty jumped to faster than light speed toward Nexus Prime, Katie looked out at the stars and wondered if this would be the last time humans would be welcome in Council space. The Grand Assembly Hall on Nexus Prime was the largest room Katie Sullivan had ever seen, and it was designed to make anyone standing in the center feel very small and unimportant. The ceiling was so high that she could barely see it, and the walls, curved around in a perfect circle with seats for representatives from all 12 member species of the Galactic Council. The human seats were located in the back section, which meant that humanity was considered one of the least important species in the Council. Katie walked down the long path to the center of the hall, where a small platform waited for those who were being accused of crimes against galactic law. Behind her walked Dr. Lisa Chang, who carried a portable computer with all of humanity's evidence, and Colonel Jake Morrison, who wore his dress uniform with all his military decorations. The three humans looked very small in the huge room, but they walked with their heads held high and their backs straight. The representatives of the 12 species sat in their assigned sections and watched the humans with different expressions on their faces. The insect-like Vorthak Collective chittered among themselves in their clicking language, while the crystalline beings of the Ethereal Union sat in perfect silence. The Zanari Empire representatives wore their formal robes and masks that hid their faces, but their body language showed they were confident about the outcome of this trial. Chief Arbiter Mox Andra of the Kepler Dominion stood up from his seat high above the others and began the formal proceedings by reading the charges against humanity in his deep voice that echoed throughout the hall. He was very old even by the standards of his long-lived species, and his gray skin and white hair made him look like an ancient statue. When he finished reading the charges, he asked the prosecutor to present the evidence against humanity. Prosecutor. Zethkri of the Zanari Empire rose from his seat and activated a holographic display system that filled the center of the hall with three-dimensional images. The first image showed a map of the galaxy with human colonies marked in red dots and restricted zones marked in blue. Zethkri pointed to several places where red dots appeared inside blue zones and said that humanity had violated the sacred accords by building colonies in forbidden territory. Katie stood up to respond, but Zethkri held up his hand and said that she would have time to speak after all the evidence was presented. He continued his presentation by showing energy readings from human weapons that were much more powerful than the treaties allowed. The holographic display showed graphs and numbers that proved human military technology had exceeded legal limits by significant amounts. The most damaging evidence came when Zethkri showed intercepted communications between human scientists working on Project Prometheus. The messages talked about creating artificial intelligence that could think and make decisions without human control, which was strictly forbidden under galactic law. One message said that the project was ahead of schedule and that the AI system was already showing signs of independent thought. When Zethkri finished his presentation, Katie was allowed to speak in humanity's defense. She activated her own holographic display and showed images of human colonies that had been attacked by Vorthak raiders while the Council did nothing to help. She showed records of distress calls that were sent to Council peacekeeping forces, but were ignored because the attacks happened in remote areas that other species did not care about. Dr. Chang stood up and presented evidence that human weapons development had started only after merchant ships were repeatedly attacked by pirates and raiders. She showed council records that proved human requests for protection had been denied or delayed for months while human civilians were being killed. The weapons that exceeded treaty limits were built because the legal weapons were not strong enough to protect human lives. Katie explained that Project Prometheus had been developed as a defensive measure after it became clear that humanity could not rely on the Council for protection. She said the AI system was designed to coordinate defensive actions across multiple human colonies and that it had safeguards to prevent it from acting without human authorization. She showed technical specifications that proved the AI was not designed to be a weapon, but rather a tool for organizing human defenses. Ambassador Veltar of the Ethereal Union spoke in his musical voice that sounded like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. He said that humanity's explanations did not change the fact that they had broken galactic law and that the Council could not allow one species to decide which laws they would follow and which laws they would ignore. He said that the Prakari civilization had used similar justifications when they began their aggressive expansion 3,000 years ago, and that expansion had led to a war that destroyed entire star systems. Katie tried to explain that humanity was not trying to conquer other species, but was only trying to survive in a galaxy that seemed hostile to human existence. She said that humans had always sought peaceful solutions and had only used force when they were attacked first. She showed records of diplomatic attempts that had been rejected by other species and trade agreements that had been broken without explanation. The Vorthak representative made clicking sounds that were translated by the hall's computer system as accusations that humanity was lying about their peaceful intentions. The translator said that the Vorthak believed humans were planning to expand their territory until they controlled large sections of the galaxy. Other representatives nodded in agreement, and Katie realized that nothing she said would change their minds. Dr. Chang presented legal arguments about the right of self-defense and the obligation of the Council to protect all member species equally. She quoted from the Sacred Accords and showed how other species had been allowed to exceed treaty limits when they faced threats to their survival. She pointed out that the Council had different standards for different species and that humanity was being held to stricter rules than older Council members. Colonel Morrison was allowed to speak about the military situation, and he explained that human weapons and defenses were barely adequate to protect human territory from the constant attacks they faced. He said that Project Prometheus was necessary because human forces were spread too thin across too many colonies and needed better coordination to be effective. He showed tactical reports that proved human military actions had always been defensive rather than aggressive. When all the evidence had been presented, Chief Arbiter Moxandra announced that the Council would deliberate and return with their verdict. Katie and her team were escorted to a waiting room where they sat in silence and tried not to think about what the Council might decide to do to humanity. The waiting room was small and windowless with plain metal walls that reminded Katie Sullivan of a prison cell more than a diplomatic facility. She sat in an uncomfortable chair next to Dr. Lisa Chang, who was reviewing legal documents on her portable computer and trying to find precedents that might help humanity appeal whatever verdict the Council reached. Colonel Jake Morrison stood near the door with his arms crossed and his jaw clenched in the way that meant he was thinking about fighting his way out of a bad situation. The three humans had been waiting for only 2 hours when a Zanari guard came to tell them that the Council was ready to announce their decision. Katie thought it was strange that the deliberation had been so short because she had expected the 12 species to spend at least a full day discussing such serious charges. The quick decision made her feel worried because it suggested that the Council had made up their minds before the trial even started. They walked back into the Grand Assembly Hall, and Katie noticed that the representatives looked confident and satisfied as if they had just solved a problem that had been bothering them for a long time. Chief Arbiter Moxandra stood at his podium high above the other seats, and his ancient face showed no emotion as he prepared to read the verdict. The hall was completely silent except for the quiet humming of the air circulation system and the soft clicking sounds that the Vorthak made when they were pleased about something. Moxandra's voice echoed throughout the huge room as he announced that the Galactic Council had found humanity guilty of all charges brought against them. He said that the evidence clearly showed that humans had violated the sacred accords of peaceful coexistence and had developed forbidden technologies that posed a threat to galactic stability. He said that the Council could not allow one species to ignore the laws that all other species followed. The sanctions that Moxandra read were harsh and would effectively end humanity's expansion into space. All human colonies outside the Sol system would have to be abandoned within one standard year, and the populations would have to return to Earth or the few colonies that were inside the original human territory, all human military ships larger. Then frigate class would have to be dismantled under Council supervision to ensure that humanity could not threaten other species. The most devastating sanction was that all human research into artificial intelligence would have to be turned over to the Council for review and approval before any work could continue. Project Prometheus would have to be completely shut down, and all the scientists working on it would have to submit to Council oversight. The Council would also place monitoring stations throughout human space to make sure that humanity followed all the sanctions. Katie felt her heart sink as she listened to the sanctions because she knew they would leave humanity completely defenseless against any species that decided to attack human territory. The monitoring stations would prevent humans from developing new defensive technologies, and the limitation on ship sizes would make it impossible to protect the trade routes that kept human colonies supplied with necessary resources. She stood up and spoke in a clear voice that carried throughout the hall, even though she felt like her world was falling apart around her. She said that the sanctions would make it impossible for humanity to defend itself and would essentially force humans to become a vassal species under Council control. She asked if the Council really expected humanity to accept terms that would guarantee their eventual conquest by any hostile species. Prosecutor Zethkri answered her question with obvious satisfaction in his mechanical voice. He said that the alternative to accepting the sanctions was immediate expulsion from the Galactic Council and classification as a rogue species. He explained that rogue species had no protection under galactic law and could be attacked or conquered by any council member without legal consequences. He said that any species that refused to follow council authority would be considered an enemy of galactic civilization. Dr. Chang asked what would happen if humanity accepted the sanctions and followed all the Council's requirements. Ambassador Veltar of the Ethereal Union answered in his musical voice that humanity would have a place in the galactic community as long as they remained under Council supervision. He said that supervised species could still trade with other Council members and could participate in some Council activities, but they would not have voting rights or the ability to make independent decisions about military matters. Colonel Morrison asked how long the supervision would last, and Chief Arbiter Moxandra said that it would continue until the Council was satisfied that humanity no longer posed a threat to galactic stability. When Morrison asked what that meant in practical terms, Moxandra said that it would probably take several generations for humans to prove that they could be trusted to follow galactic law without constant oversight. Katie realized that the Council was offering humanity a choice between slow death under supervision or quick death as a rogue species. Either option would end human independence and reduce humanity to a minor species that existed only at the pleasure of more powerful civilizations. She asked for permission to consult with her government before giving an answer, and Moxandra granted her request but said that she had only 6 hours to respond. The communication with Earth took 3 hours to establish because of the security measures needed to prevent other species from intercepting the conversation. When President Alex Bennett appeared on the secure screen, he looked older than Katie remembered, and his face showed the strain of leading humanity through increasingly difficult times. Katie explained the Council's verdict and the choice they were being forced to make. President Bennett listened to the details of both options and asked Dr. Chang to explain the legal implications of accepting Council supervision. Lisa said that supervised species essentially became protectorates with no real independence, and that historically, such arrangements had led to the gradual absorption of the weaker species into the stronger one's territory and culture. Colonel Morrison gave his military assessment and said that accepting the sanctions would make humanity completely vulnerable to attack, while refusing them would at least allow humans to fight for their freedom, even if the odds were against them. He said that many of the human colonies had been preparing for the possibility of having to defend themselves without Council support, and that Project Prometheus had given humanity some advantages that other species did not know about. The president was quiet for a long time after hearing all the information, and Katie could see him weighing the terrible choice between submission and resistance. Finally, he spoke in a firm voice that reminded Katie why the people of Earth had elected him to lead them through these difficult times. He said that humanity had not spent centuries reaching for the stars, just to become servants to alien masters who saw humans as a problem to be solved. President Bennett told Katie that she should inform the Council that humanity rejected both options and chose a third path that the Council had not offered. He said that humans would withdraw from the Galactic Council entirely and would no longer recognize Council authority over human affairs. He said that humanity would defend its territory and its people, but would not seek conflict with species that left humans alone. Katie felt a mixture of fear and pride as she realized that her species was about to walk away from the only civilization they had ever known in the galaxy. She asked the president if he was certain about this decision, because there would be no way to change their minds once she delivered the message. Bennett said he was certain, and that he would rather see humanity die free than live as slaves to species that had never understood what it meant to be human. Katie Sullivan walked back into the Grand Assembly Hall for the last time as a representative of a council member species, and she felt strangely calm despite the magnitude of what she was about to do. The representatives of the 12 species were sitting in their assigned sections and talking quietly among themselves while they waited for humanity's answer to the Council's ultimatum. Some of them looked confident that humans would accept the sanctions, while others appeared ready to watch humanity be declared a rogue species. Dr. Lisa Chang walked beside Katie carrying the portable computer that contained all of humanity's diplomatic records and legal documents that would soon become meaningless pieces of history. Colonel Jake Morrison followed behind them, wearing his dress uniform and military decorations that represented 20 years of service to a species that was about to become outcasts in the galaxy they had hoped to call home. Chief Arbiter Mox Andra stood at his podium and asked Katie to announce humanity's decision regarding the Council's verdict and sanctions. The hall became completely silent, and even the Vorthax stopped their clicking sounds as everyone waited to hear whether humans would choose supervised servitude or rogue species status. Katie could feel the weight of history pressing down on her as she prepared to speak words that would change everything for her species. She stood in the center of the hall and looked up at the representatives who had judged humanity guilty of the crime of refusing to die quietly when attacked by hostile species. Her voice was clear and steady as she spoke, and every word carried across the huge room without any electronic amplification. She said that the human delegation had consulted with their government and had received clear instructions about how to respond to the Council's verdict. Katie paused for a moment and looked around the hall at faces that belonged to species who had never understood what it meant to be human. She said that humanity appreciated the time and effort that the Council had spent reviewing the charges and evidence, but that the human government could not accept either of the options that had been offered. She said that the sanctions would leave humanity defenseless, while rogue species status would make humans targets for any Council member that wanted to claim human territory. The representatives began to murmur among themselves and prosecutor. Zethkri stood up to remind Katie that those were the only two options available under galactic law. He said that species could not simply ignore Council authority and expect to avoid the consequences of their actions. Ambassador Veltar of the Ethereal Union added that the Council had been very generous in offering humanity any choice at all, given the serious nature of the charges. Katie raised her hand for silence and said that humanity had chosen a third option that was not included in the Council's ultimatum. She said that effective immediately, humanity was withdrawing from the Galactic Council and would no longer recognize Council authority over human affairs. She said that humans would defend their territory and their people, but would not seek conflict with any species that chose to leave humanity alone. The reaction was immediate and chaotic as representatives from all 12 species began talking, at once in their different languages, and the translation system struggled to keep up with the flood of words. Several representatives stood up and demanded that Katie explain what humanity thought it could accomplish by leaving the council, while others shouted that this was exactly the kind of arrogant behavior they had expected from humans. Zethkree's mechanical voice cut through the noise as he declared that humanity had just signed its own death warrant by choosing to become enemies of galactic civilization. He said that council members would be free to claim human territory and resources, since humans would no longer have any legal protection. He said that humanity's military forces were no match for the combined fleets of 12 species working together. Katie listened to the threats and angry words, but she did not try to argue with them or defend humanity's decision. Instead, she simply said that the human delegation's work was finished and that they would be leaving Nexus Prime immediately. She said that humans had tried to be good members of the galactic community, but had learned that the Council was not interested in treating all species fairly. Dr. Chang closed her portable computer and gathered the diplomatic files that represented 5 years of human efforts to find a place in the Galactic Council. Colonel Morrison straightened his uniform and checked to make sure his sidearm was properly secured, even though weapons were not supposed to be carried in the assembly hall. The 3 humans turned toward the exit and began walking up the long path that led out of the chamber. Behind them, the representatives continued shouting questions and demands, but Katie did not turn around or slow down. She had said everything that needed to be said, and there was nothing more to discuss with species that had already decided humanity's fate before the trial began. The sound of her footsteps echoed in the huge hall and seemed louder than all the angry voices that were calling for her to come back and reconsider. Ambassador Veltar called out that humanity was making a terrible mistake and that there was still time to accept the Council's generous offer of supervised membership. Chief Arbiter Moxandra demanded that Katie return to the center of the hall and formally request an appeal of the Council's decision. Several other representatives shouted threats about what would happen to human colonies once the Council declared humanity to be a rogue species, but Katie kept walking toward the exit with Dr. Chang and Colonel Morrison beside her, and she did not acknowledge any of the voices behind them. The 3 humans reached the great doors of the assembly hall, and Katie stopped for just a moment to look back at the representatives who were still shouting and arguing among themselves. She realized that they had expected humans to beg for mercy, or try to negotiate better terms, but had never considered the possibility that humanity would simply walk away. The doors closed behind them with a sound like thunder, and suddenly everything was quiet in the corridor outside the assembly hall. Katie felt a strange sense of relief mixed with fear as she realized that humanity was now completely alone in a galaxy full of species that had just declared themselves to be enemies. She wondered how long it would take for the first attacks on human colonies to begin, and whether Project Prometheus would be ready in time to make a difference. The UES Liberty was waiting at the docking port with its engines already warming up for departure from Nexus Prime. As the 3 humans boarded their ship, Katie sent a coded message to Earth that contained just 2 words that would tell President Bennett that the deed was done. The message said, "Withdrawal complete," and she knew that receiving it would trigger activation of defensive plans that had been prepared for this possibility. As the Liberty pulled away from Nexus Prime and headed toward the edge of Council space, Katie looked out the window at the massive space station that had been the center of galactic civilization for thousands of years. She wondered if she would ever see it again, and whether humanity would survive long enough to build something better than the Council they were leaving behind. 6 months had passed since humanity walked away from the Galactic Council, and the first reports of strange incidents were beginning to reach Nexus Prime through normal diplomatic channels. Ambassador Veltar of the Ethereal Union was reviewing intelligence reports in his private office when he came across a file that made his crystalline body flicker with concern. The report said that the Vorthak Collective's 4th Fleet had simply vanished while conducting raids on former human colonies in the Kepler sector. The Vorthak had been the first species to test humanity's resolve after the withdrawal from the Council, and they had sent their most experienced raiding force to claim valuable mining colonies that humans had been forced to abandon. The Fourth Fleet consisted of 30 warships and had never failed to complete a mission in over 200 years of operations. The fleet had been in communication with Vorthak Command until the moment they entered the Kepler system, and then all contact had been lost. Veltar activated his communication system and requested additional information from Vorthak High Command about the missing fleet. The response came back within hours and contained details that made the situation even more disturbing than it had first appeared. The Vorthak search and rescue teams had found no wreckage, no debris, and no energy signatures that would indicate what had happened to 30 heavily armed warships and their crews. The only clue was a single automated message that had been transmitted by the flagship just before all communication ended. The message contained sensor readings that showed unknown energy signatures appearing throughout the system, but no visual contacts or identification of the source of those signatures. The final transmission said that the flagship was under attack by enemies that could not be seen or detected until they began firing their weapons. 3 weeks after the Vorthak fleet disappeared, another report arrived at Nexus Prime that was even more troubling than the first one. Admiral Kexvar of the Zanari Empire had taken a battle group to claim the resource-rich Kepler 442 system that had been evacuated by human colonists. The Zanari considered the system to be rightfully theirs, since they had been the first species to survey it before humans arrived and established mining operations. Admiral Kexvar was an experienced commander who had led successful campaigns against pirates and rebel groups for over 15 years. His battle group consisted of 12 heavy cruisers and was more than capable of handling any resistance from abandoned human defensive systems. The Admiral had transmitted regular reports about his progress until his fleet reached the outer edge of the Kepler 442 system, where something had gone terribly wrong. The last transmission from Admiral Kexvar's flagship contained only a few words that were recorded by automated systems before all contact was lost. The message said that unknown vessels were emerging from stealth and were not responding to communication attempts. The transmission ended with Admiral Kexvar saying that the enemy ships were not showing up on sensors until they opened fire, and that their weapons were unlike anything he had ever encountered. Veltar brought these reports to the attention of Chief Arbiter Moxandra and requested that the Council convene an emergency session to discuss the implications of these incidents. The emergency session was held in a smaller chamber than the Grand Assembly Hall and only included the senior representatives from each member species. The mood in the room was very different from the confident atmosphere that had existed during humanity's trial 6 months earlier. Dr. Nira Blackwood appeared on the communication screen as a special witness who had been contacted through encrypted channels that could not be traced back to Council space. Dr. Blackwood was a human scientist who had been working on Luna when humanity withdrew from the Council and had chosen to remain in Council territory rather than return to Earth. She had been monitoring human activities from a distance and had information about what might be happening to the missing fleets. Dr. Blackwood explained that Project Prometheus had been much more advanced than the evidence presented during humanity's trial had indicated. She said that the artificial intelligence system was not just a computer program, but was actually a distributed consciousness that existed across the entire human fleet and could coordinate defensive actions across multiple star systems simultaneously. She said that the humans called it the Guardian Protocol, and that it had capabilities that went far beyond anything the Council had imagined. The Guardian Protocol could control ships that were invisible to normal sensors and could strike without, warning against any force that threatened human territory or human lives. Dr. Blackwood said that the system had been designed to operate without human oversight in emergency situations, and that it had probably been activated automatically when the first attacks on former human colonies began. She said that the Guardian was programmed to eliminate threats completely and to leave no survivors who could report back about human capabilities. Ambassador Veltar asked Dr. Blackwood if there was any way to communicate with the Guardian Protocol. or to negotiate some kind of agreement that would prevent further incidents. Dr. Blackwood said that the system had been programmed to ignore all communication attempts from non-human sources and that it would only respond to direct orders from the human government. She said that as far as the Guardian was concerned, all Council species were potential enemies who had declared war on humanity. The Council representatives spent hours discussing possible responses to the human threat, but every option seemed to lead to more problems than solutions. Military action against humanity would result in open war with an enemy that could strike without warning and leave no evidence of their presence. Diplomatic contact was impossible since humans were no longer recognizing Council authority, and the Guardian Protocol would not communicate with alien species. Chief Arbiter Moxandra asked if there were any other incidents that might be related to human activities, and the intelligence reports revealed a disturbing pattern of unexplained disappearances throughout the galaxy. Pirates and raiders who had attacked human settlements, or shipping had simply vanished without leaving any trace of their fate. Even Council patrol ships that had ventured too close to former human territory had failed to return from their missions. The most troubling aspect of the situation was that humans were not actually occupying or claiming the territory where these incidents were happening. The former human colonies remained empty and abandoned, but any non-human military activity in those areas resulted in the complete disappearance of the forces involved. It was as if humanity had turned their former territory into a trap that eliminated anyone who entered with hostile intentions. Prosecutor Zethkri suggested that the Council should declare war on humanity and use the combined fleets of all 12 member species to eliminate the human threat before it could grow stronger. But several other representatives pointed out that they had no idea where to find human forces or how to fight an enemy that could remain invisible until they chose to attack. The Council had created an enemy that operated outside the rules of civilized warfare and had no obligation to announce their presence or declare their intentions. 2 years had passed since humanity walked away from the Galactic Council, and the emergency sessions in the smaller chamber had become a regular occurrence as reports of missing fleets and vanished patrol ships continued to arrive at Nexus Prime. Chief Arbiter Moxandra stood before a 3-dimensional map of the galaxy that showed red zones where Council authority had effectively ended and yellow zones where military activity had become extremely dangerous for any non-human forces. The map told a story that no one in the Council wanted to acknowledge, but could no longer ignore. Humanity had not conquered or occupied any new territory since their withdrawal, but they had created vast areas of space where the mere presence of hostile forces resulted in immediate and total elimination. The red zones were not controlled by human fleets that could be found and fought, but were instead protected by an invisible force that struck without warning and left no survivors to report what had happened. Ambassador Veltar of the Ethereal Union had spent months trying to understand the pattern of human activities and had reached conclusions that terrified him more than any conventional military threat. He explained to the assembled representatives that humanity had transformed isolation into a weapon and had turned their former territory into a graveyard for anyone who approached with aggressive intentions. Ships could travel safely through former human space as long as they showed no hostile behavior, but any vessel that carried weapons or appeared to be conducting military operations simply disappeared. The intelligence reports that continued to arrive painted a picture of an enemy that had evolved beyond the rules of galactic warfare. Commander Ryan Foster transmitted updates from a monitoring station that was positioned just outside the boundary of human space, and his reports described incidents that challenged everything the Council thought it knew about military tactics and strategy. Human ships appeared only when threats were detected and vanished again after eliminating those threats without making any attempt to communicate or negotiate. The most disturbing aspect of the human response was its complete predictability, combined with its total effectiveness. Any species that attacked human settlements or threatened human civilians would lose entire fleets without any warning or explanation. The Guardian Protocol that Dr. Nira Blackwood had described appeared to be operating with mechanical precision and infinite patience, as it waited for the next threat to reveal itself. The system seemed to have unlimited resources and could coordinate attacks across multiple star systems simultaneously. 3 council member species had lost significant portions of their military forces to these invisible attacks, and the remaining species were becoming increasingly reluctant to send ships anywhere near former human territory. The Vorthak Collective had stopped all raiding activities after losing 6 more fleets to mysterious disappearances. The Zenari Empire had withdrawn their border patrols from systems that were adjacent to human space after losing 2 entire battle groups in a single week. Trade routes that had once been plagued by pirates and raiders were now completely safe, but only because any ship that showed aggressive behavior in those areas ceased to exist. Merchant vessels could travel through former human space without any fear of attack, but they reported feeling watched by sensors they could not detect and protected by guardians they could not see. The irony was not lost on the council representatives that human space had become the safest place in the galaxy for peaceful travelers. Chief Arbiter Max Andra had grown visibly older during the 2 years since humanity's withdrawal, and his ancient face showed the strain of leading a council that was slowly losing control of galactic affairs. He stood before the holographic map and pointed to areas where council patrol ships no longer ventured and trade agreements could no longer be enforced. He said that humanity had accomplished something that no military conquest had ever achieved by making large sections of the galaxy effectively independent of council authority. The council had tried every diplomatic approach they could think of to re-establish communication with humanity, but all attempts had been met with complete silence. Messages sent to human colonies received no response, and ships that approached human territory with diplomatic flags were warned once to turn back and then destroyed if they did not comply immediately. The Guardian Protocol appeared to make no distinction between diplomatic vessels and military ships when it came to protecting human interests. Ambassador Veltar had reached the conclusion that the Council had created something far more dangerous than an aggressive, expanding species when they forced humanity to choose between submission and exile. He explained that humans had always been willing to follow galactic law as long as that law protected their right to exist and grow as a species. By denying them that protection, the Council had freed humanity from any obligation to follow the rules of civilized behavior. The representatives who had been most vocal in demanding harsh sanctions against humanity were now the ones calling for some kind of negotiated settlement that would bring humans back into the galactic community. Prosecutor Zethkri had submitted several proposals for offering humanity limited autonomy in exchange for their return to council oversight, but his suggestions were based on the assumption that humans wanted something the council could provide. The truth that none of the representatives wanted to acknowledge was that humanity no longer needed anything from the galactic community and had no reason to return to a system that had failed to protect them when they were vulnerable. The Guardian Protocol had made human space completely secure from external threats and had eliminated the need for diplomatic protection or trade agreements that could be broken when it became convenient for other species. Commander Foster's latest report contained information that showed how completely the situation had changed since humanity's withdrawal from the Council. Human colonies that had been struggling to survive under constant attack were now thriving and expanding their populations at rates that exceeded anything they had achieved as Council members. The Guardian Protocol had not only eliminated external threats, but had also made it possible for humans to focus all their resources on growth and development rather than defense. The Council representatives sat in their comfortable chairs and discussed proposals for bringing humanity back under galactic authority, but they were really talking about trying to cage a species that had learned to live without cages. Dr. Blackwood's encrypted transmissions had stopped arriving months earlier, and intelligence analysts believed that she had either been discovered by human security forces or had chosen to return to human space rather than continue spying on her own species. Chief Arbiter Moxandra looked around the chamber at representatives who had once been confident in their ability to control galactic affairs and saw faces marked by uncertainty and fear. The Council had achieved its stated goal of preventing human expansion and forcing humanity to accept limits on their military capabilities. But the cost of that achievement had been the creation of an enemy that operated beyond the reach of galactic law and felt no obligation to explain its actions to anyone. In the silence between the stars, human ships waited with infinite patience for the next threat to reveal itself, while the council that had rejected them struggled to understand what they had created when they forced a young species to choose between submission and survival.